Hello, everybody, and welcome to this BIA webinar on the Inflation Reduction Act, Threats and Opportunities for UK Life Science. I'm Steve Bates, the CEO of the BIA, and I'm joined by a stellar panel of experts who can guide us through this. So they'll be joining me in a moment. So the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, which is a strange acronym for those of us who are used to it in a different context in British history, is a really important thing for us to get our heads around. And it's American and it's complicated, and I didn't really understand it at all before I went to bio. And a bit like baseball, which has been over in the UK this week, it's got lots of complicated rules. You have to understand what's going on inside the US system. But the key thing is it's coming over here just like the baseball, and we need to understand it from our sector. So what I'm hoping we can do in this hour together is get to a common understanding of what it is, understand that there are experts out there, and many of the US companies are already engaged in and understanding the implications of this piece of US legislation for our sector. I'm keen that you ask questions because I'm keen to understand what it is that you guys want from us. So if there are areas of questions that you want to go into, we've got a stellar panel for you who have been working on this for many months and years. So do please put your questions in the Q&A, not the chat, in the Q&A, and then I'll endeavour to move the conversation in the direction that you want as we go forward. So I'll go around and introduce who we have with us. So Crystal Kunz is Vice President Health Policy and Research at BIO. Hi, Crystal. Thanks for joining us. Steve Usdin is Head of Policy and Regulatory at BioCentury and based in Washington, DC also, and has been following the IRA and the implications of it from both the legislative and now we're going to see some contentious court cases around this, so we'll be able to put a perspective on that. And Matt Wetzel is a partner at Goodwin, and I met Matt at Bio, and he was the first person who was able to take me through what the IRA meant for us. So perhaps we can start with you, Matt, explaining what is the IRA and what do we need to know from a basics perspective?
Certainly, Steve. Thanks so much. Really appreciate that warm introduction, and welcome everybody to our presentation today. The Inflation Reduction Act is a piece of comprehensive legislation in the United States that was passed in 2022, almost a year ago. We're at about 11 months out now. And, you know, at its core, with respect to our Medicare program, which is our government healthcare program for America's seniors, 65 and older, we'll talk a little bit more about that later today. At its core is really an effort to reduce spending on pharmaceuticals for Medicare beneficiaries. And what does that look like? Well, the IRA engages in sort of three fundamental changes to the healthcare system that we want to highlight today, and we'll dig into in greater depth. First and foremost is a redesign of the prescription drug benefit under the Medicare program. So at a very high level, Medicare beneficiaries are required to pay a part of the cost of a prescription drug when they go to the pharmacy and have their prescription filled, a copay or a cost share. And currently, the amount that a Medicare beneficiary may pay throughout the year in the U.S. is capped at around $7,500, you know, give or take a little bit, and that changes every year based on inflation and et cetera. So they're going to cap that. The IRA caps that at $2,000. So that's a significant reduction in prescription drug costs. And so as a result, we'll likely see an increase in Medicare beneficiaries filling prescriptions and not making that sort of economic decision around whether they should fill a particular prescription or you know, purchase some other good or service. So how to pay for that is the question that the IRA seeks to answer, and it does that through a couple of ways. First, It obligates pharmaceutical manufacturers to pay a certain percentage of the drug cost when a beneficiary gets that prescription filled. So that could be a 10% up to 20% discount. And notably, when a Medicare beneficiary has exceeded their out-of-pocket spend, $2,000 a year, the manufacturer's financial obligation is 20% of the cost of the drug. The Medicare program's responsibility is also 20%. So the IRA seeks to align the Medicare program and manufacturers' financial interests. Well, there's other ways that the IRA also seeks to pay for some of these changes. First and foremost, and probably the most discussed with pharmaceutical and biotech companies, is the drug price negotiation program, whereby Medicare is now given the leverage to require manufacturers to negotiate for the price of drugs paid by the Medicare program. And this is limited to high cost brand name drugs and biologics without competition, no generic or no biosimilar competition on the market. The program will select about 20 drugs per year to go into the program once it's fully up and running. And a manufacturer can expect at least a 25% reduction in price based on the drug's average price. However, the Medicare program can go much lower depending upon how long the drug has been on the market without competition. We can talk about some of those details, but notably, there are a few exceptions to the program. So if you are a small biotech company, there's a few years in which you could be exempt from the program. It's sort of a limited duration. There's also a price floor for small biotech companies as well. Again, limited duration. Orphan drugs, these are drugs that receive an orphan designation from FDA, can be exempt from the program. However, only if there's only one orphan designation, not multiple designations, and the only indications that are approved by FDA are for that disease. And then the program will not look at drugs that have a spend of $200 million or less per year. Then there's the second piece of it as well, which is an inflation rebate. So the Medicare program will also obligate all drugs, most drugs, I should say, including generics and biosimilars, to keep their price increases per year or per quarter, depending upon what program we're looking at, to the same rate it would be if it increased by the rate of inflation. If the price increases faster than inflation, the Medicare program expects a payment in the difference. And so these three changes really are groundbreaking in terms of how the government pays for drugs. And what we've seen as this program gets underway, the drug price negotiation program in particular, the first set of drugs will be selected in September of this year. We have seen, as Steve, you referenced in your introduction, the filing in the past few weeks of lawsuits challenging the constitutionality of the Inflation Reduction Act, and we can certainly talk about that as well. But really, what's at the forefront of biotech and pharmaceutical companies seeking to do business in the United States or actively doing business in the United States? It's this potential for the drug price negotiation program to impose really significant price caps on how much the federal government will pay for the product.
Matt, that is fantastic. I remember when I used to start doing webinars about the implications of Brexit for the sector. People used to ask me to try and do it in 5 minutes. It took me about 5 months. You've got that down pat. So it's a big bill that's gone through Congress. They're starting to have big impacts, and particularly it's popular, it sounds like, because it's going to be for the population. They're going to go down from drug prices of, if you're paying $7,500, that's quite a chunk if you're an American senior. I looked at the UK prescription charges, which have gone up 30 pence this year, from £9.35 to £9.65. And of course, if you're senior in the UK, you don't have to pay them anyway, nor do you pay them in Scotland. So you can see how different it is for us getting our head around this. And then there's lots of this which is going to have a real impact on the sector because of the consequentials, because of how the pay is going to work. And that's where, Crystal, if I can, I'm keen to turn to you. You work at BIO, the fantastic trade association for life science companies based in the US, and have been dealing with this as you deal with the US healthcare system all the time. How are companies, particularly small and medium-sized companies or biotech companies, thinking about this, and how are they reacting? What questions have they got as a result of this big piece of legislation?
Sure. I think, an overarching theme that I hear from our members most often is that this new negotiation program is fraught with uncertainty. And uncertainty is not a good thing. There's a lot of unanswered questions. Basically, the timeline, and I think Matt alluded to this a little bit, is kind of our first big date will be September 1st of this year, when it's announced that 10 drugs are announced for this negotiation process. And this negotiation process will play out for about a year. And then a year from September, so September of 2024, CMS will announce what price it's negotiated for these 10 drugs. But what happens during that year process is, I think, an issue of great concern for our members. And I could kind of touch on a couple things in particular that I think could give you a little bit more understanding of where these concerns lie. First of all, CMS, that's the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. This is the agency that's implementing this Medicare negotiation program. And so what CMS is going to do is, collect information from a vast variety of stakeholders. And they're going to kind of collect information that is in two general buckets. One is in this bucket of like research and development costs, manufacturing costs, sales data, that kind of stuff. The other bucket is around the therapeutic value or, therapeutic benefit of a therapy and alternatives to those therapies. So what we hear from our members is kind of like, first of all, how is CMS going to evaluate all of this information? What information are they going to give more credence to versus not? How are they going to kind of share how they're thinking about it? To date, the draft guidance that we've seen from the government agency about how they're going to implement this is very concerning. It seems more like a one-way street where entities are submitting a bunch of information to the government and not a lot of clarity about what this means for the companies whose drugs are selected for that initial, year of negotiation. Also, in its initial proposal in terms of how the negotiation process would play out, CMS, Centers for Medicare, Medicaid. Sorry, I'm trying not to use acronyms.
No, keep going. You've taken us through it once, but it's basically the lot who have to implement this, the government agency that have to implement this for Medicare and Medicaid. So they're going to have an important new role, and probably, I don't imagine if they've not done this before, then they've got to skill up on that as part of the process.
Exactly, and I think that's another critical question. Do they really have the expertise? They were given significant funds by Congress to implement this law. How are they using those funds? And, to date, we've just also been concerned about kind of the general framework they've laid out, which is basically companies, you submit all this information to CMS and, we'll have 1 or 2 meetings with you. And I think we would like to see the opportunity for our companies to have an ongoing dialogue, to ensure that it's like a thoughtful process, to get an understanding of how CMS is viewing different evidence and why, and how that's going to affect the, determination they make about what the price the Medicare program should pay. So circling back to my, first point, it really is just, this level of uncertainty that gives our members a lot of pause right now.
Crystal, thank you, and I do encourage people to ask questions, please. If I've pitched this wrong and you are deep experts in this, these guys can go a ton deeper than I'm pitching this, but you may have areas where you want to go to. So thank you, Crystal, and it is interesting to see. It feels a little bit like when in the UK, NICE and the whole process of healthcare HTA was introduced. There was lots of concerns at that stage and lots of uncertainty. And it feels a bit like something like that is almost as big as that was in the UK system is in the global system. But Steve, as a journalist, as a man who's followed our sector in deep for many years, you must love this, because it's going to give you stories every week, because it doesn't sound like it's sorted out. Uncertainty means stories, and if there's all these things, then they're going to run. And of course, I imagine what's most exciting from your perspective in terms of being able to write about this is that it's now contested. So although it's gone through Congress, it looks like it's going to end up in a judicial process as well as a congressional process.
Yeah, well, I think, you use the analogy of people trying to understand baseball, but it's more complicated, because it's like if the baseball game started and then the referees huddle every now and then and think, well, we're going to change the rules. And then one of the teams says, well, no, actually, we're going to sue the other team or sue the referee to actually change the outcome of it before it's over. We're going to take a break for a little bit of that. And then Congress gets in the act and says, well, wait a second, maybe we don't even like baseball. Maybe we should get rid of the whole thing, So it gets to be very complicated. So I'd say, the IRA really is a moving target. And there's three different ways that it can change over time, right? There's the way that the CMS, that's the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, as you put it, the lot that's going to have to figure out how to make this work. They can change the way that they implement it. There's litigation that's ongoing, and then there's the possibility of legislation. So I'll just walk quickly through all those three things. CMS has issued draft implementation guidance, and it's set to release final guidance soon, maybe as soon as Friday. And this can be critically important. Some of the topics that are in flux include how broadly CMS is going to interpret, for example, the exemption from price negotiations for drugs that are derived from blood and blood plasma. We haven't mentioned that, but there's a carve out in the law that says that blood and blood plasma derived products aren't subject to negotiation. Well, the companies that manufacture CAR T therapies hope that they're going to be exempted. They expect that they're going to be exempted, but it wasn't completely clear from the draft guidance. There's also a question, for example, of how the exemption for drugs with a single orphan indication will be implemented. The rare disease community wants CMS to start the clock ticking on price negotiations when a second indication is approved. But there are others who expect that what CMS is going to do is they're going to say that a second approval then starts the clock ticking at the time when the first approval came in. That's critically important. And I should back up and mention one thing that hasn't been mentioned, which is, I think, really essential about understanding the whole IRA, which is that there's a differential between the way it treats small molecule drugs and biologics. Yeah. Small molecules are subject to price negotiation after 9 years, biologics after 13 years. There's historical reasons why that is. We can go into that if you want, but it has massive implications. It, especially for companies that are watching this, thinking about it, it creates a tremendous incentive to invest in large molecules. At the same token, it makes it much more difficult for companies to invest in small molecules going forward. Second thing is litigation. This is going to proceed in two waves. The first wave has already started. That's lawsuits claiming that the IRA violates various parts of the U.S. Constitution. Merck, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Bristol Myers Squibb, and Pharma, they've all launched suits. They're overlapping. There's a little bit of difference between them, but they all broadly make claims that the law violates the U.S. Constitution. They've been filed in different jurisdictions, which is interesting. And then I think everybody expects at some point one or more of these suits is going to end up at the Supreme Court. If they're successful, the suits has a potential to actually completely throw out the price negotiation provisions of the IRA, or maybe to modify it. There's a second wave of litigation that's coming that aims at procedural issues with the ways that CMS is implementing the law and the ways that Congress specifically wrote the negotiation provisions. Those suits are likely going to be filed after the final implementation guidance is released, so that companies and perhaps trade associations know what it is that they're reacting against. So sometime, starting next week, there'll be a race to the courts, and we'll see a bunch of suits like that. Those suits may delay implementation. They may circumscribe implementation rather than eliminate the program. No one knows what the outcome of those suits is going to be, what the timing of it's going to be. It's very difficult. I don't think it would be very wise for anybody to make investment decisions or business decisions based on assumptions about how those lawsuits are going to come out. Then there's legislation. Bills seeking to modify the IRA are going to be introduced, and I think soon. There's a Republican senator who plans to introduce a bill that eliminates this distinction between small molecules and large molecules. He does it by increasing the time to negotiation for small molecules. He'll be fortunate if he gets one Democrat to co-sponsor the bill. It's not going to pass, right? There's also going to be legislation introduced seeking to extend the single orphan exemption to include any drug with only orphan indications, regardless of the number of indications. Again, in this Congress, not likely to pass. But you have to ask, what happens in the next Congress? What happens in the next administration? If there was a Republican president, it's possible, but far from certain, that CMS could shift gears on the IRA. Even without legislation, it could decide to change the way that it implements the law to make it much less burdensome on the pharmaceutical industry. For example, it could say that the minimum discounts that are specified in the law are going to be what the discounts are going to be going forward. That's something I think broadly that the pharmaceutical industry could live with. But again, you can't bet on this. Look, the Trump administration was extraordinarily eager to use any tools that it had at its disposal to reduce drug prices. It certainly wasn't sympathetic to the pharmaceutical industry. So we don't know that that would happen. Legislation that substantially changes the IRA is only going to happen if one party has a trifecta. You know, if they have both houses of the Congress and they have the White House. But again, all bets are off as to what they would do if they had that complete power. You know, traditionally going back in time, you would say, oh, well, if the Republicans have control of both houses of Congress and the White House, that's going to be good for the pharmaceutical industry. Given the political animus toward the pharmaceutical industry that's bipartisan and concerns about drug pricing, I certainly wouldn't put any money on that. So there we go. It's pretty complicated. It's going to keep everybody busy for a long time going forward.
Well, Steve, thank you. Thank you for cutting through it and giving us some sense of it. I think you're absolutely right that it is that strange thing where we've got to play the game whilst the rules are being written. And I think we are already starting to see some of this having an impact into our sector. We're starting to get some questions in. So, Steve, it's back to you. How do we expect the lawsuits from Merck, BMS, etc., to play out? Do we have any sense of time frame or what might happen in that first wave?
You know, Matt's the lawyer. I don't
Sorry, Matt, I'll throw you under the bus then.
I don't pretend to be a lawyer. I do think that I've spoken to a number of lawyers about it, and it's interesting. Like anything like this, you know, a lot of the lawyers have complete confidence that these suits are going to prevail and that they're just going to knock the thing out. And there are just as many lawyers that say, no, that's ridiculous. These suits are going to be laughed out of court and nothing's going to happen. I'm interested to hear what Matt says, but I also think that it's really unpredictable.
I couldn't agree more, Steve. I think that, you know, what we see with respect to, as you noted, the sort of 4 suits filed to date, multiple jurisdictions, somewhat overlapping claims. I think there's, you know, certainly an opportunity for there to be, you know, sort of a split amongst the courts as to how the law should be implemented or can be implemented, I should say. And so, you know, there could be some element of, you know, sort of inter-court, so to speak, dispute there that would require a resolution at sort of the higher levels of our judiciary. I will say I do think that these suits have a sort of bigger picture precedential meaning for the country, in the sense that the focus is, you know, how greatly can Congress invest authority in a federal agency that is so unchecked? As Steve, you know, alluded to, you know, part of the issue with the Inflation Reduction Act's drug price negotiation program is that there's no sort of judicial review or administrative review for those decisions. we talk about the negotiation process and how it's conducted in a black box, that manufacturers are subject to a gag order that prohibits them from disclosing publicly any information, and in fact destroying any information that they receive from CMS as part of the negotiations. And among other areas as well, significant and hefty fines, excise taxes that are really penalties for companies that refuse to participate in the program. All of this is really, antithetical to how the federal administrative state is supposed to work in the United States, with the levels of transparency, checks and balances, et cetera. And so I think there could be some bigger meaning coming out of these cases. How is it going to apply directly to the IRA itself? Well, I think, not everything will change. I mean, I think the Part D prescription drug benefit redesign we talked about at the outset, that limiting of out-of-pocket spend for Medicare beneficiaries, that likely won't be subject to the outcome of the litigation. The inflation rebates, that's something that is part of other government drug reimbursement programs as well. So probably not going to see any change there. However, what the companies that have filed these cases are looking for is, declaratory relief. In other words, a declaration that the Inflation Reduction Act does violate the Constitution, and injunctive relief, the opportunity to delay the program or stop the program's applicability on September 1st at least. So yes, I think it's tough to, and I love how you put that, Steve. I mean, it's tough to place bets right now when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act. My take is we'll probably see, some different opinions coming out of the various courts here. I'm a little bit sitting on the sidelines watching to see what happens. To Crystal's point, I think over the course of the next year, we'll have a great deal more sort of knowledge about how this program, to the extent it does go into place September 1st, we'll have more knowledge about, how much CMS will exercise that authority. But I think Steve did a great job in highlighting kind of, all the unknowns here.
I think one of the other things that's important, just to jump in quickly, because it may be confusing for people who are watching who aren't intimately familiar with the U.S. system, is that this law affects the prices that Medicare pays, right? And that's primarily for people who are 65 and older. To the extent that companies have drugs that are not for the Medicare population, they will be less or perhaps not at all affected by this law. So one of the things that it's likely to do is to steer drug development into diseases that primarily affect the young or the middle-aged, and away from drugs that primarily affect the people who are older. The other thing, because of this differential between the way that it treats small molecules and large molecules, again, is it disadvantages small molecule drug development, which from a public policy point of view is a tremendous mistake. And again, it's going to drive things toward these areas where there are exemptions. If the blood and plasma exemption really does carry the day for CAR-Ts, that's going to be a big boost for CAR-Ts and other kind of cell therapies like that. So I think that's one of the things that people watching need to think about is it's not something that's going to affect everybody and every drug the same way.
No, thank you, Steve. I think about it. I mean, it makes me realize a couple of thoughts. And Crystal, I'm coming to you next. I'm thinking that we think of the US as being the land of the free and a place where free markets rule, whereas in fact, this is a significant intervention in price control in a significant part of the market. And Crystal, the question that we've got is, what proportion of that US drugs market is Medicare prescriptions? And do you think it will have, or do companies think it's going to have an effect on pricing in the private market as well? Will it drive changes, or will it, as Steve says, lead to people going to areas which are not affected by this and pioneering in spaces which are away from the risk of these controls? Because it's not even everybody who gets controlled, is it? It's a series of, you get picked to go into this process, and not everybody will do it on day one, if I've got it right.
Right. I think, well, and Matt and Steve can correct me. I mean, the Medicare drug market, I think roughly, I don't know, Medicare spending is usually about what, 20% of the market. There's what, like 60-ish million Medicare beneficiaries and a US population of 300 some million. So, I mean, it's not half the market, but it's a significant part of the market. I think, Steve is absolutely right about what this means for investments in certain types of drugs, small molecule versus large molecule, and also investments in therapies that are more, targeted toward the non-Medicare age population versus the Medicare. At the same time, for products that kind of cross over both markets, yes, what is happening in Medicare applies to the Medicare program, but I think there will also be indirect impacts on other markets. Like, for example, when these final negotiated prices are announced, potentially in September of 2024, those will be made public. So commercial payers will know now what Medicare is paying for X product. And if that happens to be a significant product for them, they're going to be asking questions saying, why am I not getting that price? So I think there will be, some impacts beyond the Medicare market for sure. But as Steve alluded to, it also depends kind of where you are, a product on the market now, it's a bit of a different situation versus companies making decisions about where, to put their investments.
So thank you. If we can turn to that point now, and I think that is probably where biotech companies and the BIA membership are probably thinking about this, which is how, given that there's uncertainty and given that there's a big change ahead, how should late stage clinical companies in the UK think about this or approach it for the next couple of years as they gear up for commercialization in the most significant market for any the most significant healthcare market in the world, which is the US? Matt, what have you been advising or getting people to think about?
Yes, it's a great question, Steve, and I hear from clients on a near daily basis now, how should we be thinking about this? What's the impact to different arrangements that we want to engage in? For example, co-commercializations, royalty arrangements, licensing agreements, et cetera, and whether, there should be this idea that if a product or an asset, which may only be in sort of the conceptual stage right now, if down the road that asset is subject to the drug price negotiation program, which, as noted, has this sort of limited window to derive ROI for all of the significant costs that go into the R&D for that product. And here we're talking about a potential 9-year or 13-year cliff for ROI, depending upon whether you're a small or large molecule, as Steve alluded to before. The idea is, if you're selected for that program, should you be subject to a step down in the royalty payment or the licensing fee? Again, though, this is very conceptual. It's very academic right now. Certainly, there are some companies that are starting to include in their royalty payment provisions or licensing fee provisions language about step downs. But, to put it in a little bit of perspective, if you're, for example, building a biologic and you receive your BLA license for your first indication on, let's say February of 2026 or later in the year, the earliest that you'll be selected for the program is February of 2038. And the price caps that result won't go into effect until 2040. So it's difficult to put that level of prediction into these very significant financial arrangements between biotechs and pharma companies, biotechs and investors, et cetera. So certainly, I think it's important for companies to be mindful of the impact of the IRA. But just think about, as Steve noted before, the level of uncertainty is pretty significant. I mean, if we're talking 2040, that's what, 4 or 5 congressional or presidential elections, 8 or 10 congressional elections. There's a lot of change that could happen between now and then. Again, you can't necessarily bet on that change actually happening, and you have to think about, what would be the potential, quote, worst case scenario, end quote. But at the end of the day, I think right now the conversation is, academic, conceptual, moving into, some more tangible changes to royalty and licensing provisions.
But I've heard from CEOs of, especially of pharma companies, that they are making decisions today that are actually derived from the IRA. So, for example, I wrote a story a week ago, 2 weeks ago, based on comments from the CEOs of Genentech and Novartis, and both of them said the same thing. They said that they had small molecule cancer drugs that are being developed, that in the absence of the IRA, they would go to what they call faster to market strategy with the small indication, and then build up to bigger indications. Because they're going to have this 9-year clock ticking, they're going to forego, or at least they're seriously considering foregoing, the smaller indications and waiting, in the case of Genentech, he said 3 years until they have a bigger indication that's ready, and going with that. That has commercial implications. Obviously, it has implications for the companies that might partner with them. But also, if you think about it, it has implications, and they're quite, well, honestly, horrific for the patients who look at it and say, well, look, this company is saying they could have had a drug for me. In the case of Genentech, they're saying, you know, they had a drug that they think it could work quite well for ovarian cancer, but they're not going to file for ovarian cancer. At least they're going to wait 3 years and file in a much bigger indication later. That's you know, that's really something that people have to think about.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think that takes us to a couple of the questions that have come in, which is about indication selection. And perhaps we can look at it through the prism of orphan drug designation first, and then perhaps oncology. So as you say, you're saying that basically under the provisions as they are now, orphan drugs, if are predicated on basically their licensing regime is predicated on the first indication. Do you think this is going to have a real impact? Because I know that often orphan drugs start in one space and then can move quite widely, or be targeted against a range of other diseases with which there are no products. Crystal, maybe you'd like to start us on that one.
Yeah, this is a top priority for us. I mean, there are things that I already spoke to that we're kind of dealing with on the, you know, regulatory side with CMS. But on the legislative side, this is one of our top priorities. I think Matt, you know, when he talked about the IRA generally, there is an orphan exemption from negotiation, but it is incredibly limited. And it is for just one, you know, if you have an orphan designation for one rare disease, you're exempt. But if you then get an orphan designation for another rare disease, you're not exempt from negotiation anymore. I frankly am not sure that Congress knew what it was doing with this. I think, you know, I think what they were really trying to do was target instances where, you know, there's a drug that's orphan and then it's also like a blockbuster, you know, drug for a much more common condition. And, you know, where they landed was not in a good place for the reasons that Matt and Steve have already talked about. I mean, this is just, it's really troubling. And I think one of the top things we hear from our companies, and as I said, it's on the top of our list of things that we would like Congress to address. We're hopeful it's something that Congress will address because there is an exception already. So it's not like we're asking for something new. We're just trying to, you know, improve it and make it work better, you know, for patients.
And I would point out that there already have been examples of companies that have said that they have drugs that are approved for a single orphan indication. Alnylam was kind of the poster child for this. They have a drug that's approved for a single orphan indication. They were ready to go with phase 3 trials for another orphan indication for Stargardt's disease, a cause of progressive irreversible blindness. And they pulled back from that. My understanding is they're going to develop a separate molecule that's similar that could be tested for Stargardt, but at a minimum that has delayed access for those patients for, I don't know, a year, 2 years, 3 years. I don't know what it's going to be for some period of time. And again, it's a progressive disease. People, if this drug is effective, there are going to be people who lost vision and aren't going to get it back because this law created an incentive or disincentive for the company to invest in that second indication. And one thing I would say about what Crystal said just really quickly, I think my understanding is it's not so much if you get a designation for a second orphan indication, so you get an approval for a second orphan indication, which is it's a nuance, but it's an important one.
Yeah, you know, you're right.
Yeah, I just want to echo Steve and Crystal's comments here, and just to highlight that, even in my own discussions with clients, a lot of these conversations come up. How should we be thinking about indication sequencing? How should we be thinking about launch sequencing? Should we focus on launching a product in other countries versus starting in the United States? That's a conversation that comes up. Somebody mentioned earlier this idea that, maybe the research focus should be on indication areas that don't have a heavy Medicare population, and therefore the impact might be less significant. These are all absolutely conversations based on, the nuances of the law. So the orphan drug issue, the small biotech issue, the large versus small molecule issue, the idea that, we don't have indication-based pricing in the US. And so therefore, the clock starts to tick, so to speak, at that first indication approval. But I think also the uncertainty that surrounds the Inflation Reduction Act. We talked about all those areas of uncertainty that really create sort of, iffy investors who may not necessarily want to invest as significantly, or might invest in more stringent terms than previously, just given that level of uncertainty. So I think there's, sort of the specific legislative issues, and then just this amorphous uncertainty around the application of the law that's really creating some difficulty in the industry.
So my sense is that certainly when you've got a big change, sometimes the biggest companies are tooling up and will be informing themselves of all of the potential options, and they will bring that to bear if there's an opportunity when they have discussions or negotiations with suppliers or people they're looking to do deals or licensing with. So I think from a small company perspective, this is why it's really important to have this on your radar, because there's a good chance you're going to get asked some questions about this, or it may have implications for the thing that you're developing for the largest market that you're going down. So, I mean, Steve, have you seen practical decisions where people are making decisions these days? And do you think that that's something that biotechs really need to worry about now, or could we leave it a year or two until some of this uncertainty is a bit clearer?
No, I don't think it's a wise thing to leave it. There are decisions that are being made now. Everybody knows this is an industry where decisions are made well in advance of approvals and of reimbursement decisions and things like that. I think one of the things that's interesting about this law also is that it creates a competitive advantage for the large companies. It's going to make it much tougher for small companies. Because if you think about it, if you've got a small molecule, you've got 9 years to make whatever it is that you're going to make on it. So you need to have as large, make as big a splash as you can, as quickly as you can. You need to be able to launch it as aggressively as you can to get to peak sales as quickly as you can, and also to launch it in as many indications as quickly as you can. You can't really do a kind of stepwise serial development, which has been common. Keytruda is the poster child for that, for example. I think there's a sense that the big companies are going to be better prepared to do that. There's also some of the big companies are going to be the first ones who are going to feel the bite from the IRA. They're going to have losses of revenues that they hadn't anticipated prior to its enactment. So they're going to be also on the hunt, and they already are on the hunt for acquisitions so that they can plug those gaps.
I think it's one of the aspects of the IRA that I find to be kind of the most remarkable. We talked about these sort of warped incentives or disincentives, for companies that really want to go all the way. They want to just take the product from inception all the way through commercialization. They're focused on, certainly investment, but, not necessarily looking to exit or be sold to a large pharma. The IRA imposes very significant administrative burdens that, to Steve's point, large companies can certainly bear, the cost of some of those administrative burdens, the data tracking, et cetera, the reporting obligations. But it creates a significant burden on small companies that might otherwise want to go all the way through commercialization. They may make choices about exiting earlier than they ordinarily would.
Thank you. So I'm going to do the what I call the upsides of Brexit question, which is often when we were doing this around Brexit, people would say, "Can you give me the list of potential upsides?" There's always winners and losers when you have change. So what are the upsides from the industry that we can be thinking about here? And is there space for countries ex-US to really become primary launch markets, particularly in multiple indications?
Well, there's as you alluded to at the beginning, one of the upsides is going to be work for Matt and for the lawyers for the rest of their lives. You know, I think there's an upside for companies, obviously, that are looking at, for example, pediatric indications. I think, which is something that is definitely, there's been underinvestment in pediatric cancer, for example, and other kinds of pediatric indications. So there'll be tremendous upside for them. I'm skeptical about the idea that companies are going to go overseas in large numbers with large numbers of products and launch them elsewhere and then come to the United States. It's not as if there's a great deal of enthusiasm for the pricing paradigms anywhere outside of the United States. And, you know, I think it will mean that companies have to be more global. And again, that's going to advantage the big pharmas to the extent that there's less revenues from the United States, or they're less predictable. They'll want to launch in markets outside the United States more rapidly, but it's not going to be the savior. It's not going to be like companies we're going to start seeing huge numbers of products launched in Europe or the UK or Japan before they are in the United States. It may be one or two, it may be a little bit, but it's not going to be a massive wave.
Thank you. We've got a couple of more technical questions, which I'm going to go to. So, asked, is there likely to be an impact to those therapeutic areas that can apply for priority review vouchers, i.e., infectious disease? Not necessarily age-related, but that can be stated that pharma biotech could slow down on their go-to-market strategies and change decision makings. Is that something we should be worried about?
I mean, maybe I'll weigh in here. I think when it comes to infectious disease products, you know, it really is going to depend, I would say, on the cost. So if you think you're, you know, a super high cost product, then there could perhaps be an impact, as is the case with, you know, any sort of, you know, sector that has higher cost drugs. For infectious diseases, though, and other folks on the line can correct me, I may be off mark here, but typically my understanding is that, you know, those products may not necessarily be, you know, as high cost as some of the other drugs that we see out there. But that one, I'll let other experts weigh in on that question.
I think there's another nuance here, which we don't have time to go into, which is the difference in the United States between the billing structures for small molecules and infused drugs that are infused or injected in a physician's office. There are different models for them, and the IRA tries to treat them the same. I'm skeptical about whether that's really going to work out in practice or how it's going to work out. And I think to the extent that companies are developing drugs that are infused or injected in a physician's office, that's likely to be less affected by the IRA than small molecule drugs, though it's very complicated very quickly to explain why.
No, Steve, I do get that point, and it's a bit like explaining leg before wicket to somebody who doesn't understand cricket on these particular points on how the pricing structures have bundled within them both process as well as product in certain types of Medicare and Medicaid, and you're absolutely right. So I think it's one of these ones where, as you say, it gets complicated very, very quickly. I've got a question here about, does the orphan designation exemption apply to all aspects of the bill? For example, the wastage refund aspects as well as price negotiation?
I'm, you know, searching my brain. I mean, the orphan exemption is just related to the negotiation program. I don't recall any other, unless but again.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah,
that's correct.
Sorry, it's become an episode of Jeopardy for you, hasn't it? Or a Family Fortunes, if you like, a quiz show. I don't want to make it too difficult here. So,
Steve, could I just ask something? I'm sorry to interrupt. I wanted to circle back on one thing, because I didn't see another Q&A right now, but so if you don't mind, and I know Matt touched on this a little bit, the manufacturer gag clause. And I think there was a comment in the Q&A about like, was this kind of like nice? Now, there are many of you on the webinar who are much more knowledgeable about NICE than I am, but I think I just wanted to kind of reinforce what Matt mentioned about the manufacturer gag clause. Right now, the rules that the government has kind of outlined for the negotiation process are, I mean, it's really incredible what they've said. They've basically said, drug company, when you enter into the negotiation process with Medicare, you cannot talk about it at all, is essentially what they say. You know, so I just wanted to reinforce that. I think this is at the top of our list of things that, you know, we've engaged with the agency on, pushing back that this is like, I mean, if they want to operate in secret, this is how you do it. But we don't think that is, you know, for the good of any of the stakeholders in the system. So I just wanted to reinforce that as a top priority. And I didn't know if others wanted to kind of talk about that, you know, how CMS has outlined the process here and how that compares to how things, you know, work.
Well, one of the things is not only are they not allowed to talk about it, but they're instructed to destroy all of their documents and to certify that they've destroyed their documents related to it. And then the law has a provision that states that if the government believes that a company has submitted false or misleading information, they can go after them for monumental civil penalties. And the companies may be in a position that they really can't defend themselves because they've been forced to destroy all of the documents related to the negotiations. My guess is, look, we're going to see on Friday, hopefully, whenever it is that the final implementation guidance comes out. My guess is that's the part that's going to be changed the most because you know, CMS's attorneys are going to say, well, look, that's really not tenable, and if they keep that in there, it's going to, at a minimum, delay implementation of everything while it gets litigated in the courts. But that's my guess, and maybe it's kind of foolish to make a guess about something that's so soon. We'll see whether I'm right or not.
Yeah, I've been saying maybe a little bit tongue in cheek that the IRA's drug price negotiation provisions are simultaneously draconian with their imposition of significant excise taxes, sort of, you know, not in proportion to the quote unquote, you know, wrong of the manufacturers, Machiavellian in the sense that the ends justify the means, i.e. the reduced drug prices are viewed as you know, being justified as justifying the, you know, sort of lack of notice, lack of judicial review, lack of administrative review, and then Orwellian, and that you can't even talk about what goes on behind closed doors with the government. So it's, you know, I think, not to be, you know, sort of breathless and dramatic about it, but I do think there are pieces to the IRA that really kind of emphasize some of the significant authority that Congress has granted the agency here without a lot of checks and balances.
So thank you. I'm conscious we're coming close to the top of the hour, and we've had a good run at this. I propose to give you each a final chance to make a statement, and then I'm going to remind people that the expertise you've seen on this webinar is not only available through this webinar, but Steve has got a fantastic portal on BioIndustry. Matt, you've got some great products which I hope we can share from Goodwin, which is a basic information and areas there. And Crystal, of course, we work closely with Bio, and people know the fantastic job that the organisation does in championing and being able to be the voice of the sector in DC. And as many of these barriers will come up, we know that you'll be campaigning away. And if there's anything we can do from a UK perspective, we're always happy to lead in as members of the International Council of Biotech Associations. But it feels largely it's going to be your job to push this one uphill in DC. So with my thanks, can I just offer you both all the chance to give us a final comment? Steve, perhaps you first.
Basically, what I would say is that this is not something that only affects companies in the United States, that any company that is developing a drug that they hope to sell in the United States, that they hope to license to a company that's going to sell it in the United States, or that hopes to sell itself to a company that's going to sell its drugs in the United States, which I assume is basically everyone. It's going to affect them all equally, and unfortunately, you have to understand it, or you have to get somebody who understands it. It's going to be something that's going to come up in licensing negotiations, in M&A discussions, and the decisions that companies make early in development can be critical to how their products are going to look in terms of the IRA. So it's not like you can say, oh, well, that's just going to be somebody else's problem down the line.
Steve, thank you. Matt.
I want to emphasize and echo Steve's comment. I would also say that the IRA is complicated. There's a lot of moving parts with a lot of nuance and the ability to kind of go deep in the details very quickly. And so if folks are reading through the summaries or looking at this and thinking, gosh, I don't know how to make heads or tails of this, you're not alone. And so those details, coupled with the uncertainty that we talked about today, has left a lot of folks scratching their heads. So if you're in that position, you're, again, not alone, and there's we're all here to help to guide and instruct.
Thank you, Matt, and you've been a great guidance to me already, so thank you. Crystal, last word.
Ditto to everything said, and I think maybe just circling back to what Steve and Matt talked about earlier, I think none of us have the answer as to how this is all going to play out. So much depends on what happens in the courts. There's no clear path. I mean, it's anything can happen. And also what in the world happens, in Congress and with our presidential election. All of those factors are going to be kind of important for us in terms of I'm focused on the day-to-day implementation with CMS, but very well aware of the very dynamic environment that we're working with in DC. So it'll be interesting, if we did this webinar a year from now, again, I could say everything is very different or nothing, right? I'm not sure.
No, well, thank you. I think what's always good is a problem shared is a problem halved, and hopefully an insight into the complexity of this gives people some idea as to why they're likely to be asked questions around it. And at least you can form some idea and go on your own learning journey around either the specifics, depending on where your product or company is, or understand why we're going to keep this on our agenda and why it's important going forward. So thank you for staying with us. And first of all, thank you to Crystal, Steve and Matt for sharing your expertise. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to learning more either through your own channels or perhaps through another event with us at some time in the future. Thanks all and have a good day.